So, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off recently released on Netflix and it was such an enjoyable watch. I found the art style really energetic and colorful, and in this video I want to check out all the parts and pieces that give it its distinct visual flavor. I'll be breaking down each element with a demo at the end so that you can use this knowledge in your own art and projects. While I'm not really discussing the plot, there will be some brief spoilers from images and clips I'll be showing from later episodes, but with that being said, let's get straight into it. The original Scott Pilgrim comics were created by Canadian author and cartoonist Brian Lee O'Malley, with its original run beginning in 2004 and ending in 2010. The series consisted of 6 black and white volumes, which were then later developed into full-color hardbacks, colored by Nathan Fairbairn in 2012. For Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, Brian Lee O'Malley returns as a co-showrunner alongside Ben David Grabinski. The animations were handled by Science Saru, a Japanese animation studio based in Tokyo, with Abel Gongora directing the episodes. Science Saru are perhaps best known for the contribution on 2 short films in 2021's Star Wars Visions, but also shows like Devilman Crybaby and the upcoming Dun Dun Dun. The entire cast from the live-action film Scott Pilgrim vs. the World also return, as well as director Edgar Wright and writer Michael Bacall. Something I find really interesting is how, in Scott Pilgrim, the same story is told through different mediums and each of them have their own strengths. With Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, it's almost as if things are coming full circle. The original graphic novels were heavily inspired by manga but made in the West, and now the anime draws upon said graphic novels. So it's like this blend of different cultures that gives Scott Pilgrim such an interesting and unique visual look. The overall style in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is textured, grungy, and imperfect. I find this pretty fitting to the punk and indie vibe of Scott Pilgrim's universe, and the show's opening immediately captures this tone. Director Abel Gongora notes that some inspirations included Gorillaz illustrations or anime like Dragon Ball and Street Fighter 2D. The fight scenes are frenetic, intense, and capture so much energy and movement. A major theme in the story of Scott Pilgrim is about looking at the past and becoming a better person, so it makes sense that the show leans into a nostalgic retro feeling with its art. There are references to old video games and movies, and this analog feeling extends into every facet of the show's art style. For example, let's take a look at how the line art is done. Rather than be comprised of entirely clean strokes like a lot of other animations, the line art is instead inconsistent with its thickness. It's a little spotty and jagged, and this is done to mimic the energy of real ink brushes, which Brian Lee O'Malley used in the original graphic novels. In fact, Abel Gongora has said that the original graphic novels were always the primary touchstone when working on the anime, in addition to fan art, the film, and browsing through forums. One thing to note is that although the line quality is imperfect to mimic ink, the confidence of the lines themselves are bold and clean. The animators and artists are extremely economic in this way, simplifying a lot of details with a single stroke. This pairs in really nicely with the strength of the shape language and character design in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Although there are some visual differences in the anime, most of the characters retain their look from the graphic novels. Brian Lee O'Malley's style is very distinct, with influences from manga artists like Osamu Tezuka and Kiyohiko Azuma, but also from Western comics as well. Let's check out the way that characters' eyes are drawn. They usually take up a huge portion of the head, which puts a lot of emphasis on these windows of the soul. Since they're all inked, we don't get to see their true eye colors, save for some moments of emphasis. Knives Chow in particular is drawn with just black dots, which is mostly faithful to her graphic novel appearance. In the graphic novel she does have the top eyelid drawn, whereas it's even simpler in the anime as just being dots. Something I particularly like about this art style is how hairstyles are drawn.
Isn't this one girl with hair like this?
There's a lot of fast angle changes, and tufts of hair are often represented with these small curved triangles, which continues leading the eye up and over. They have such strong shapes and silhouettes to them, which makes reading the characters quick and easy. Another thing that makes the character design so appealing is that their features and clothing are drawn with much longer and softer lines compared to their hair. A lot of the character poses in the show follow through, meaning there's often simplified curves around their torso and legs that remains largely uninterrupted, giving a nice flow of movement. A big advantage that the anime has over the live action is the exaggeration of characters' features and body types. For instance, characters like Lucas Lee are comically large, no pun intended, which makes them feel much more physically imposing. There's more variety this way, which in turn strengthens their personality through design. A good way to introduce this kind of shape language in your own art is to think about big, medium, and small. So instead of repeating shapes, a good trick is to change size variation and break patterns. Definitely play around with curves and straights and keep things simple where you can. Now, when it comes to lighting these characters, it's also very simple. In a lot of anime, there's usually one shadow and one light pass, but in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, shadows are actually used very sparingly. I've noticed that the shadows are only really reserved for underneath the neck or some areas on their clothing, but almost never on their face. There's a lot of restraint here, which helps to further stylize the characters by not overcomplicating their render. And because of this, their expressions are emphasized that much more. These expressions are also a lot more exaggerated because of the anime style, with animations of mouth movements being just an open and close instead of having realistic vowel shapes. It's actually quite endearing and cute. It's extremely easy to tell what a character is feeling through these expressions alone. Now, this is just a side note, but I find it just so awesome that they managed to get the original cast from the live action back into Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. I find that this decision really catalogs the growth of Scott Pilgrim as an IP since the film was released back in 2010. You also have to love the references to Edgar Wrong and Simon Pegg and Nick Frost showing up to cameo as well. Now, unlike the characters, the backgrounds in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off are more complex and showcase a wide variety of textures. Instead of the colors being nice and blended, we usually see these horizontal bands of strokes across the environment. This is quite different from backgrounds in the graphic novels, which all needed to be inked. It would have taken Brian Lee O'Malley a lot longer and cost way more to have extremely detailed environments. Because of that, there's more line art and black shadows in the graphic novels versus the show. The setting of Scott Pilgrim takes place in Toronto, Canada, specifically around 2010, and director Abel Gongora had to sift through hundreds of photos of what streets looked like during that time for his research. And this even included looking at what furniture and electrical appliances looked like to gain a better understanding of how people lived their lives back then. Gongora goes on to say, "I also digitally walked so much through Toronto, trying to find the streets that reminded me of the places we see in the comics, and looking for cool spots we could use later." This was done using Google Maps and changing the date to have a more immersive and true experience of what things used to look like. Now, I'm specifically mentioning this part here just to highlight the importance of research when it comes to your own art. You don't really have to have like every single thing figured out, but having enough limitations will help you make better creative decisions in the process. For example, it's useful to ask yourself why a character is in the location they are, and why things look the way they do, even if it's not an extremely detailed answer, but just enough to keep you going. On a more technical aspect, items that characters interact with are usually drawn with line art, while everything else remains painted. This is a pretty common visual trope in animation since these objects have to animate and it would just be too time consuming to give them the same level of detail as everything else. Overall, the environments are quite sharp and graphic despite having a lot of texture, which gives a nice level of contrast and really helps sell the illusion of capturing a time and place. Now, something I've purposely been saving to the end to look at is what I find to be the strongest visual aspect of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, and that's the post-processing. The show evokes a nostalgic feeling of old 90s and 2000s cartoons through its use of camera imperfections like film grain and chromatic aberration. This makes it feel like we're watching it on old CRT TVs, which adds a timeless quality to everything. Something I'm a fan of in most animations is where the line art is mixed together with all of these real-world effects. So let's take a look at chromatic aberration, for example. I personally don't think it's enough just to know how to do something, but also theory of why. It just, again, goes back to making better decisions when it comes to art. So chromatic aberration or color fringing is the red, green, or blue fringes you'll sometimes see near the edges of objects and characters. It kind of looks like an out of focus 3D effect, and it's actually based off an imperfection that occurs with real-world cameras. So why does this actually happen? Well, it occurs whenever a camera lens is unable to focus light wavelengths properly. So light has to pass through glass to reach the sensor, and red, green, and blue wavelengths will all line up differently. By using chromatic aberration in your art, it automatically gives it a retro kind of feeling, but it can be overdone really quickly if you're not careful. I find that subtlety is key, and I'd recommend reserving it for things out of focus, or if you want to get really scientific, leave it for the edges of your image where most of the fringing will actually occur in real life. If you're curious about how to do this in Photoshop, I do have another tutorial that you can check out right here. Another thing you might have noticed is that all of the light bloom has very distinct shapes. Instead of being circular, they are hexagonal. While this may seem like a stylistic choice, this is actually also based on something called camera bokeh. The word itself is Japanese that means blur or haze and refers to the out of focus lights you'll see in images. This happens because of a shallow depth of field, which is tied with the aperture blades on a camera. Some of these blades are smoother and circular, which produces rounder bokeh, and some are sharper and hexagonal, which gives us that graphic look in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. So we can kind of see how all of these real world things come together and pushes the anime's look to give it a very distinct visual style. The fight scenes are where a lot of these post-processing and graphics shine the best, with light blooms spilling out of the screen and fire and laser effects being animated so well. It's like a visual feast for your eyes, and I found a lot of these sequences really engaging and entertaining. The use of wide angles here also really helps push the energy, and foreshortening works to create very exaggerated poses that our characters end up in. So now, with that being said, I'm going to do a short demo with one of my OCs named Aris, and kind of tying in everything that we've taken a look at today. I'm going to start first with the line art. At this stage, everything is still really loose and scratchy, but that's okay because I'm only thinking about the character's pose and how to convey my story. I'm imagining in this scene that Aris is sitting down talking to Wyatt in their town called Recon Valley, and she's just basically explaining to him the different comings and goings of the town. Once I'm finished with my basic sketch, I'll then move on into a bit of a tighter line art. So at this stage, I'm using that ink brush that I have and really focusing on simplifying the forms and making sure the line art comes across nice and clean like it does in the show. So I'll have to go over a couple of these lines as many times as I need until there's a nice smooth stroke. And then once that's done, I move on into the color flats. So in the color flats, I'm just basically using the lasso tool in Photoshop and then filling all of the characters with a base color. From there, I'm going to separate everything into the local color, which is just, coloring in things like the hair, the jacket, and the clothes, and all that kind of stuff. This is also done by using clipping masks just to make sure that my shapes stay nice and clean as I'm going and starting to render everything else. So in the background, I've also started filling in a couple of silhouettes for rocks and things like telephone poles, and I'm really trying to make this place feel a little bit more interesting and lived in as I continue painting. At the beginning, I didn't really have too much of an idea of how I wanted to dress the background, but as I continued developing the scene, I realized that I could add a little bit of props here, a couple of bushes, maybe a wooden fence in the background, just a couple things again to make the composition a little bit more interesting for the viewer. And if you're curious, the entire painting that you're seeing took me about 2 hours, and that was including all of the planning that I'd done at the start. So at this stage, it's pretty straightforward. It's just like a normal render as you would painting other things. But I'm also referring and looking to a lot of different references to see how Scott Pilgrim Takes Off handles things like foliage or rocks, and how all of the artists at Science Saru went about rendering those things. So I noticed for sure that a lot of the forms remain very simple, and basically anytime I caught myself over-rendering, I had to be like, no, stop it, and then just pull myself back a little bit. I think that's one of the freeing things about this art style is that you can communicate so much by showing not a lot at all, and a lot of it is carried through the actual stylization and simplicity of all the forms. I don't know if that makes sense. I feel like I was talking and not really saying a lot just then. Just for me personally, something that I really had to pay attention to as well is just to turn my brain off and stop overanalyzing as I'm actually painting. The main thing with this style is having fun and opening up, and things don't have to be 100% realistic as well. Now this bit is pretty important to nailing the look of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, and that's the background blur. So what I've done is I've duplicated my entire background and merged it into one layer, and then turned down the opacity and shifted it across so you get this kind of tracing effect like this. From there, I'm going to put it into a separate group and then create a mask. As you can see, I'm using now an airbrush to paint back in that effect so I can control where my blur is. I actually really like the way that this turned out, and instead of using the regular Gaussian blur in the future, I'm probably going to do this method as well. And now it's just all of those tiny finishing touches to bring everything together. So like I mentioned earlier, it's using that chromatic aberration or the camera bokeh, and everything ties in so nicely to create the final image here. Okay everybody, that's going to bring us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope that you were able to take something out and put it into your own art and projects. You know, as I was writing this outro, I was considering doing the whole YouTuber shtick about like and subscribe and all this stuff, but then I was like, yeah, whatever.